What sort of renewed political determinations and impetus will countries bring to the summit this year?
So there's so many different angles at which we need to tackle the climate crisis politically.
How can we achieve the sustainable goal by 2030?
Well, I think the goals will be achieved by all of us, all 193 countries, all of the private sector as much as possible, contributing towards this.
What key roles do you think Chinese business can play in this process?
We're very keen to be able to strengthen the links between the Chinese private sector and financiers and investors and the African continent.
Hi, Santa. It's so nice to meet you here. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me for this interview.
Since the 2020 Climate Ambition Summit, the development of international frameworks has accelerated. What sort of renewed political determinations and impetus will countries bring to the summit this year?
It is really important to have the Climate Ambition Summit this year. It also comes at a time when we're doing the SDG Summit, which marks a reflection on the midpoint of the Sustainable Development Goals. But let me come back to climate, because I think around the world, no matter where you've been over the last 3 years since 2020, we've experienced some of the most devastating and extreme weather outcomes. As you know, there have been floods. The world is at its highest ever temperature rises. I think July was the hottest month on record in a significant number of years historically. And a consequence of this extreme weather has been failed droughts, lots of displacement and disaster. And really now more than ever, I think there's a worldwide acknowledgement that the climate crisis is real. It's not something that's happening in the future. It is truly upon us. And so therefore, I think as we enter the Climate Ambition Summit, there's a real awareness that we're falling far behind keeping that goal of 1.5 degrees alive. If anything, the trends and the data show that we're veering closer to 2 and beyond. And we've seen what that means for planet and for people. I think we're also very much aware through a lot of the discussion that has been happening, also reflecting on issues such as the Bridgetown Initiative that has been led by the Prime Minister of Barbados and other leaders, that there is the need to mobilize a significant amount of financing to address climate. Reflecting back on the COP, the climate conferences, last year's COP was in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. This year it moves to the United Arab Emirates. It's very clear that we do need stronger, intergovernmental cooperation to be able to drive forward all of the agreements, the ambition, and the desire to address the climate crisis. We know the mitigation call, keep the 1.5 degrees alive, but we've also heard, governments come together and rally around, completing the commitments made to the adaptation fund so that countries can adopt and adapt their resilience and their sustainable and long-term approaches to climate. At the last COP, there was also the loss and damage fund, because we acknowledge that there's parts of the world where really climate has already had a truly adverse impact on country, on economy, and on communities. So there's so many different angles at which we need to tackle the climate crisis politically. Here at the Global Compact, we deal with private sector, and business too has been so adversely impacted by the climate crisis. It's affected their resilience, it's affected their markets, it's affected their inputs. And there's a strong call to action that we are making the UN Global Compact for companies, first of all, to sign on and recommit to keeping that 1.5 degree alive, to commit to net zero targets, and to really look at how they can green their businesses, their operations, and their processes.
In your speech in 2020, you emphasized that sustainability boosts a company's commercial resilience and urged leaders to prioritize it. At that time, only 4% of appointments reflected this commitment. How has this changed so far?
And again, it's so interesting comparing the world in 2020 to now where we are 3 years later. At that point in time when I spoke about the fact that oftentimes CEOs are not really, their performance is not necessarily judged by their attainment or their advocacy for sustainability outcomes and achievements. But what again has happened over time, we conducted our CEO survey, and we do this survey of CEOs around the world. And in our most recent CEO survey, polling over 2,600 CEOs, we got some very interesting and stark data. CEOs around the world, north, south, east, west, large company, SME, all stated that the top 10 challenges they were facing in business were no longer related to business. It wasn't about their business product or their brand love or how they sat in the market. It was about things external to business, the climate crisis, inflation and hyperinflation, social injustice, how to address, all of the changing regulatory environment and the impact that has on business, supply chain sustainability and resiliency, the threats of another global pandemic. So CEOs are now facing, I think, this global challenge of problems that are not only unique to a country, to economy, to a business, but really bring the world together, as we've seen in the last 3 years. I think the last 3 years have been characterized by what we call the 3 Cs, conflict, COVID, and climate. And CEOs are feeling that they're in positions where they have to respond not only just to business, but to the stakeholders, the shareholders, the customers, and citizens on these issues. So whereas perhaps performance might not formally be measured by that, CEOs are feeling that their performance as a CEO is intricately tied to being able to address issues above and beyond what their business calls for. Again, what does this mean? It's a real good and strong reflection of what we've called for within both the UN, because Secretary General has called for what he called a multi-stakeholder, multilateral network of responses, demonstrating that business is one of the stakeholders around the table. It's multilateral because your business is affected across borders. But at the Global Compact for us, it really reflects our commitment to our 10 principles, the importance of adhering to human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption. And, tying it back to the Sustainable Development Goals, urging businesses to contribute to the SDGs, but also recognize that the SDGs in and of themselves are great business, and they also provide solutions to solving for the world's challenges. So, CEOs find themselves in a unique place. We at the Global Compact feel that we have the opportunity to connect CEOs to other CEOs, to provide tools for companies to be able to equip themselves, but also to really use the frameworks that we have to strengthen CEOs' ability to respond and sit at the table.
How can the medium help to speed up the move to the zero carbon and support collaborative efforts such as the cross-sector solutions?
I don't think we would achieve anything that we want to achieve without the media. I think, first of all, you carry the messages out there for us. And I think it's really important, to continue to have very balanced reporting and balanced views on what we do. I think there's a huge opportunity to continue to provide platforms where we can demystify the Sustainable Development Goals, our principles, the imperatives for business. I think that's one. How do we simplify what might look like complex issues around the climate crisis, yet we know that day by day we feel it as individuals or as businesses or as families or as communities? I think media plays such an important role in helping us carry those messages and really highlight what the calls to action can be. I think that is the first. How do we align on passing the messages, highlighting the urgency? I think it is important to talk about the very challenging scenarios we're in, but I also think that we need to provide opportunities for people to react. So I'm not a proponent of too much doom and gloom. I think what we need to do is provide calls to action, very clear pathways for governments, for businesses, for business leaders to be able to act and react. That is the first. The second is media is a sector in and of itself. So when we talk about how do we address or combat the climate crisis, when we talk about issues such as living wages and gender disparities, I think the question is, to what extent does the media itself, individual companies, also demonstrate responsible and sustainable business practices? So there's two ways. I think you're an important carrier of messages, but secondly, media in and of itself. To what extent can you demonstrate value within the principles, contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals, and just responsible and sustainable business practices?
Since 2020, following a speech by the Chinese government, China has advanced green transformation and significantly impacted global climate response. As the 2023 Business Forum endorses global thinking and local action, how can we achieve the sustainable goal by 2030?
Absolutely, and let me commend the tremendous progress, particularly on the human development indicators that has occurred in China. Been following that with keen interest. Let me also mention our local network, our local chapter in China that now has close to 900 or so companies that are making great strides on climate, on equality issues, and many others. So I think lots of progress in that regard. I think the goals will be achieved by all of us, all 193 countries, all of the private sector as much as possible, contributing towards it. So for me, I think the calls to action continue. In this September week, what you'll hear coming from the Global Compact is a call for the private sector to commit to raising ambition, raising actions in 5 key areas. The first will continue to be climate. It's very important to keep the net zero commitments and the 1.5-degree trajectories alive. I think that's the first. The second is to look at living wages, to make sure that companies, not just at headquarters, but in their supply chains, can pay, a living wage, and also look at issues such as gender pay parity within roles and jobs. The third is to look at water stewardship and water resilience. Water is probably one of the most undervalued resources, yet so critical to us, to our own living and sustainability, as well as for companies and businesses. The fourth is around sustainable finance, and how can we mobilize the financing that is needed to drive forward, the transitions, both for the Sustainable Development Goals as well as issues such as energy, climate, and digital transition. So we have strong calls to action for the private sector, and I think that collectively, from businesses and from governments, we should really reflect on the key message that will come out of the SDG summit, which I believe will be, we have 7.5 years to go. We're at the midpoint of the summit. What do we need to do to turbocharge all of our actions, from government policy to enabling environment to business commitments, to be able to move progress forward?
The Belt and Road Initiative has received active support and participation from African countries since its launch. With the Global African Business Initiative focusing on energy, digital transformation, and inclusive growth, what key roles do you think Chinese business can play in this process?
Right, yes, the Global Africa Business Initiative, or GABI, as we fondly call it, enters its second year of convening towards the end of the high-level week in New York. And I think GABI is a really important platform for demonstrating the opportunities for business, for trade, and for investment with the private sector in Africa, but also demonstrating that African private sector is ready to do business in Africa, but also in the world. We talk about transitions, the climate transition, the energy transition, the digital transition. None of that can happen without the active engagement of the African continent and its private sector. And indeed, China's been a big partner, particularly on infrastructural projects on the African continent and other business-led investments. And so we're very keen to be able to strengthen the links between the Chinese private sector and financiers and investors and the African continent, because I think we believe that, again, in the true spirit of multi-stakeholder, multilateral relationships, there is a real opportunity for doing business, inclusive, sustainable, resilient business with the African continent. And I think really what Africa is saying is it's open for business, it's open for investment, and there is adequate resource, skill set, manpower, strong businesses, strong African businesses to bring to the table as well.
Thank you so much for your time, Sanda.
Thank you so much.